I'm Ralph Preston. William Lowe and I are here doing another roadmap segment, and tonight we're going to talk a little bit about what I have heard referred to as blocking, and William calls eliminating unnecessary movement. And they're pretty much the same thing. A lot of times we have different words for same kind of concept. So, William, why don't you're going to start us off with talking a little bit about your ideas on eliminating unnecessary movement.
Yeah, sure thing. So I think I think in recovery after stroke, there are a lot of things a stroke survivor really has to become aware of and identify in order to make the most of their recovery and also get the most out of their quality of life after they've had a stroke. And this idea of eliminating unnecessary movement, it's not one of the biggest things a stroke survivor has to know in their recovery after stroke, but I would say that it's the small thing which can make a big difference in anyone's recovery after stroke. And this applies to you whether you are in the early days of your recovery after stroke or even in the later stages of your stroke recovery, whether this be 3, 4, 5, or even 10 years in your recovery after stroke. And the reason why I say this is because in recovery after stroke, your brain tends to have its own agenda of what it actually wants to do in recovery. And in most cases, and more often than not, your brain actually wants to take the easy way out, which is why we see a lot of stroke survivors talk about how whenever they're walking, they feel like they're walking as if they're drunk. They feel like they have to wait for a little bit of time on their stronger leg before they can throw their affected leg forward, which is often the reason why they experience drop foot in their recovery, and they might require AFO in order to help them clear the ground whenever they're walking. So I think where eliminating unnecessary movement comes into play is it's actually this idea which you can apply in your recovery to allow your brain to learn how to perform movements at a higher quality level and really dial into the signals, dial into how it used to send signals to turn on and turn off muscles correctly, like it used to before you had a stroke. So, for example, in recovery after stroke, for a lot of stroke survivors, they might find that whenever they want to try and lift up their affected arm, rather than them being able to lift up their affected arm like this, like normal, quote unquote normal, they lift up their arm by compensating by using a lot of their shoulder and a lot of what's going on upstairs, resulting in a sort of crane-like movement where they're heaving their shoulder over. In other words, their brain is treating their arm almost like a dead weight, and their brain has been conditioned to send more signals than necessary, or in other words, turn on more muscles than is necessary to actually lift up their arm, rather than turning on the actual muscle, which was responsible for lifting up the arm before your stroke. Because before your stroke, obviously there would be multiple muscles which would be involved in lifting up in performing movements, but more often than not, it would be one muscle which would be doing the job. And after stroke, obviously, because of the way that stroke recovery works, if you're not applying this idea of eliminating unnecessary movements, your brain can get into a situation where you're using too much effort to perform something which would have only required a little bit of brain power before you had your stroke anyway. So how does this work in recovery after stroke? So going back to what I said about lifting up your arm in recovery after stroke, how a lot of stroke survivors find that they're heaving their arm like this and it's almost like a crane. One way which you could eliminate that in your recovery and teach your brain how to lift up the arm a lot better or at a higher level is to actually perform exercises or put your body in certain positions where it's able to stop your brain from compromising itself and performing the exact same movement like it used to. So, for example, if you're a stroke survivor and you're watching this right now and you're in a situation where whenever you lift up your arm, you lift it up like a crane, and this situation resonates with what you're currently experiencing, one exercise you could do is you could actually lean against the wall with your affected arm facing the wall and try to lift up your arm while leaning against the wall. And what this does is you're actually using the wall as a tool to help assist your brain in guiding it towards the correct direction of learning how to perform a movement like you used to before. And the reason why this happens is because the wall is actually going to stop your brain from bringing out your arm like this and force your brain into lifting up the arm straight and turning on the correct muscle, which is actually used to lift up your arm like you did before you had your stroke. So in a sense, what you're doing is this idea of eliminating unnecessary movement. It's doing things in a strategic way where you're stopping your brain from getting into bad habits of wanting to use too many muscles or using too much brain power to perform a movement, which would have only required a little bit of effort before you actually had your stroke. Now, having said that, another way which you can eliminate unnecessary movement when it comes to your recovery after stroke is actually performing movements rather than standing up, but lying down on the bed. So for those of you who have gone through insurance and received physical therapy through insurance, you might remember that sometimes you might have done exercises while you were lying down in bed. For example, these exercises might be your lower leg, your leg exercises like your bridges, like your leg lifts, and maybe maybe you even did some upper limb exercises with your shoulder as well. So doing exercises while lying down on the bed is another way you can eliminate unnecessary movements in your recovery after stroke and guide your brain towards learning how to perform higher quality movements, because by lying down in the bed with your back against the bed, what you're doing is, if you're trying to teach your brain how to lift up the arm, what you're doing is that you're positioning your body in such a way that the bed is going to stop your brain from compensating by turning on too many shoulder muscles to actually help lift up the arm anyway. When you compare this to standing up, you might find that it's actually a lot easier to actually lift up your arm, because your brain is actually able to compensate by turning on the trunk muscles, which results in you being able to lift up your arm like this. Sure, you can lift it, but it's not going to be at a very high quality because you're allowing your brain to cheat. So when you're lying down on the bed, what you're essentially doing is you're using something else to stop your brain from sabotaging itself and conditioning itself in getting away with performing a movement at a not so in a not so desirable way compared to how you used to do it before you actually had a stroke. And unless you're a fan of obviously lifting up your arm like this for the rest of your life, be my guest. But if you're serious about your recovery, I would recommend, really thinking about how you can eliminate unnecessary movements in your recovery after stroke, using some of the techniques which I've shared, which are just one of the many, which are just one of the few techniques which you can use to eliminate unnecessary movements. And just to add on to that, another thing you can do is you can actually use splinting or arm splinting to actually encourage your brain to actually stop allowing the fingers to ball up into a fist like so. So the whole idea of putting your hand into a splint is to preserve that blueprint in your brain, which is responsible for your hand. So splinting, in a sense, is a way of eliminating unnecessary movement. And one of the things which I discovered in my own recovery, as well as helping to coach stroke survivors in theirs, is the idea of using finger splints such as these to help stop your fingers from curling in. So I'll just put one on now. As you can see, this finger splint actually stops my index finger from bending down fully. So when you think about these finger splints, what you're actually doing is you're eliminating unnecessary movements and you're conditioning your brain to stop allowing your fingers to curl in too much. Because quite often in recovery after stroke, when the fingers want to curl in too much, it's because the muscles which you use to flex your fingers, they're too overactive, and your brain is sending too many signals and it doesn't know how to regulate those signals in the way such that it's able to relax those fingers or relax those muscles which you use to flex your fingers and curl them in. So that's just another example of how you can use different tools and different techniques to eliminate unnecessary movements in your recovery, and I guess guide your brain towards the right direction when it comes to muscle re-education and teaching your brain how to perform movements at a much higher quality level. Now, earlier, Ralph, you and I, we were having a discussion about this idea of eliminating unnecessary movements in recovery after stroke. And I know you obviously have your interpretation of it. You use different words to describe the exact same thing. But I'm just interested to know, did you have any thoughts, or did you want to share any of your experiences with this idea of eliminating unnecessary movements with the folks watching today?
Sure. I didn't, I guess I didn't know that either of the terms we're using or the concept. Early on in my recovery, though, I did get kind of assigned the deal with the wall where you can slide you can hold your affected side against the wall and then slide your arm up and down various ways. That's one way of eliminating any kind of movement this way or whatever. I did also some theraband stuff where I would pull out and pull in, and I would either, well, I got to where I could hold my arm there. This is my affected arm. I got to where I could hold my elbow there, but in the beginning I would like hold it in position so that I was only working. I think these are the muscles that do your rotator cuff. So I did that in different ways with some therabands. I didn't really do bridges right away. I knew about core work and stuff, and I introduced them into my own recovery, a few years after I recovered. What else? Oh, when I had a lot of trouble getting my affected arm up over my head, and I worked on a dowel, and somebody mentioned doing snow angels on the bed. It's another one where you're laying on your back, and you can do them with your legs too, because when you do a real snow angel, you move your legs too. I mostly was doing them when I finally got to where I could stand and move that shoulder above level. That's a real stumbling point. I had pain above there. But when I got to where I could do it, I wanted to be able to do it voluntarily. So I laid on the bed. The other thing about snow angels is they're bilateral. You got righty over here, in my case, helping lefty, because your brain does things easier when you do them together. One side helps the other a bit. Those were the things. You mentioned crawling. I've had worked with a couple people where we had them crawl. One didn't have so much trouble opening their hands, the other did, and they went from crawling almost, on the backs of their fingernails to a much more open position. They didn't quite get all the way open, but they got pretty darn close and definitely helped. So those are some of the things that I did. I know there's more to know about this. Oh yeah, I've heard people try different things. I'm looking down at my gait belt that I used for yoga this morning, and it reminded me of, I've got a friend who I was talking about keeping my elbow in and learning how to do it. He took a gait belt and strapped it around his torso in various ways, and particularly that way, so he'd strap it right here, so he could do that one without any other, by isolating the muscles. So I guess, we're both talking about the same thing, trying to isolate the muscle, but I guess in two ways, both with the movement by constraining or blocking, and then also by making the right brain to muscle connections to teach the brain to fire only the ones that you want. So it's kind of, I guess, a two-part thing. If you can isolate the movement, then I would think that it would help make the connections. That's same as the example you were using with, laying on your back. It keeps your back and shoulders and all the rest of that from firing and interfering with simple, not so simple, with basic arm movement. So those are some of my thoughts. You have any more?
Yeah, I just want to add on to what you said, Ralph. Because I forgot to mention this when I was talking about the idea, is that I believe I said that it allows your brain to dial into how it sends a signal. And yeah, that's just another way of saying that it helps when you do this correctly and when you're able to eliminate unnecessary movements. Using techniques which we discussed and we shared, such as using the wall, lying down in bed, etc. And I know Ralph shared some. What you're essentially doing is you're putting your brain into a situation where you're giving it a very targeted exercise, which will allow it to learn how to perform a movement at a very high level and also at a very high quality. And I think if there's one thing I've learned about exercise, throughout my journey, myself as well as coaching other stroke survivors in their journey as well, is that the more targeted an exercise is, or the more targeted practice is, the more beneficial it's going to be for your brain, because you're giving your brain a direct reference point on how to actually perform a movement which you used to do before you actually had your stroke. And when it's right there in front of it and your brain is able to reward itself and have a sense of whether or not it's doing something correct or as close as possible as it did before your stroke, it's more likely to connect the dots a lot easier compared to if you were to do an exercise where maybe it's not so targeted. For example, you're trying to strengthen up your grip with one of those hand grippers. Your brain doesn't really have to think because you're just banging out repetitions, and you're not really targeting. You're not really allowing your brain to target those muscles correctly. Sure you are, but it's very much it doesn't require a lot of brain power. It doesn't require your brain to really dial in to how to actually send those signals, because what you might find with those hand grippers is by the 10th repetition, your brain would have already fried its circuits because it requires so much effort to actually turn on those muscles to actually flex the hand gripper. And it becomes a situation where your brain conditions itself to use too much effort to actually turn on the muscles which you use to flex the fingers, which might actually result in a situation where you find that your fingers are curled up in a fist all the time because you've conditioned your brain to turn on the muscles which you use to flex the fingers too much, compared to actually allowing your brain to get into a situation where it's actually able to relax those fingers. Whether this be using something like a finger splint to stop that from happening, or actually performing other exercises where you are intentionally positioning your fingers in such a way so that you can't curl them in too much. For example, I might have something like a notepad. So with something like this, if I'm gripping it, there's no way I can do that, but rather I'm forcing my fingers to flex down from the fingertips, like so, and actually stay straight when I'm actually gripping the notepad, rather than allowing my brain to condition itself to flex all the way like that, and condition your brain into getting away with being able to turn on too many of the muscles which you use to flex the fingers to actually get something which requires a lot of fine motor skills to do, like you did before you had your stroke. By all means, if you're a fan of gripping a notepad like this, go for it. But if you're serious about your recovery and you want to get as close as possible to before your stroke and get back more functional use of your hand, I would encourage that you give your brain the challenge of trying to pick up a notepad like this, only flexing from the fingertips, rather than allowing your brain to get away with something which is very gross motor and maybe doesn't require as much brain power as being able to control the grip like so. So I think Ralph, you and we're pretty much talking about the same thing. Obviously, you have your own descriptions of how you describe it. And I have my own interpretation of it. And I think this just basically comes to obviously our own journey as stroke survivors and our own experiences of recovery as well.
Well, yeah, oftentimes we're talking about the same thing in different terminology. I didn't know much about, I guess I got told, there was rewiring the brain, and I got shown some things that work specific muscles. And I just, I didn't know that much about the terminology of either blocking or eliminating unnecessary movement. But all I tried to do was get pure movement, worked on muscles that I was working. And I think that plays into the neurological aspect, because that's what you're doing in the examples that you gave as well. However you're achieving it, laying on the bed, up against the wall, strapping your arm to your torso, whatever. So my experience once again was, I kind of lucked into something that worked for me, because I noticed when I did pure movement, I think it was first when I was doing curls, I had a lot of sideways, a lot of shake and a lot of sideways stuff. And so I started blocking my elbow and doing them smaller. And then I learned to stick that left elbow against my ribs, so that I could do what I calling, for lack of a better term, pure movement. So that's what I did. So the more you can, however you do it, work the muscles you want to work, then you're playing into I think the brain muscle reconnection thing. So William, have anything else, or should we end this here?
No, I don't think so. I just think, for all those folks who are watching this, really, really take to heart what we're sharing here. Because like I said, this is a small thing in recovery after stroke, but it's something which, if you know and if you can apply in a very strategic manner, it can really make a difference in recovery, especially if you do find yourself in one of those tricky situations where, let's say, maybe your fingers are balled up in a fist, or maybe you find that your arm is lifting up like this rather than straight up or as close as possible to how you used to before you had your stroke.
All right. Well, we'll end it with that. Let's see. You got two things to say real quick. If you like these roadmap discussions and you find them useful, tell us so. There are comments down below. If you have a question about anything or want us to follow up, we'll also answer questions there. So feedback's a good thing. And I guess until next time, William, thank you for your time. And thanks to everybody out there for watching.
Thanks, Ralph.